These are the paint colors I'll be using for today's seashell. You don't need these exact colors, just get somewhere close. You'll find a list of these in the video description down below. Cerulean blue, cadmium orange, burnt umber, and permanent rose. If you do not have bleed-proof white, a white gouache would work just as well. These are the supplies I'll be using for today's tutorial. You can look at the video description to find a list of these supplies, pause the video, and gather your items. Also in the video description is a line drawing that you can download and print at home. Once you've printed it at the scale you would like to paint it, I want you to tape it directly on top of your watercolor paper. I am working on a watercolor block today, and instead of applying graphite to the back of the line drawing and tracing, I have these graphite transfer sheets that I like to use. I just have to be very cautious of the amount of pressure I use, otherwise the lines will come out too dark. But either way works. Just trace your subject. Once you've traced the entire image, you're going to have a line drawing on your watercolor paper, and then just remove your line drawing. Do keep in mind that if your lines are too dark, you will be able to see them in your finished painting. The downside of using a transfer graphite sheet is a lot of times the lines will not want to erase or lift up. So it just depends on your pressure and the brand that you're using. So right now I've got some lines that are a little darker than I would prefer. So I'm just going through and using a kneaded eraser to lighten some of those lines, because today's subject is lighter in color and I'd rather have minimal lines show through in the finished product. So I'm just going through with this kneaded eraser, trying to lighten things up before. Now I'm not too worried about the lines on the very outside edge of the shell because I plan on giving this painting a darker background. But all the lines on the inside, I rather they are a little softer. Once you're happy with your pencil lines, we're going to do a little bit of prep work using masking fluid. I'm going to use a number 6 round, and before I dip my paintbrush in my masking fluid, I'm going to use a small cup of water that I have put Dawn dish soap in. And the benefit of coating your paintbrush with soapy water is it will protect your brush against the masking fluid. That way it doesn't ruin your supplies. Now there are a few areas on today's line drawing that I've kind of identified as where we want some of our masking fluid to be. The purpose of these areas is they are areas where we have brighter whites in our subject. And I don't want our paint colors to just completely take them over. So masking fluid is going to basically keep the paint out of these zones where we're applying it. These are all areas where we want some bright whites.
Sometimes where I apply my masking fluid, I allow there to be some texture. And the way I achieve that texture is just a very light touch, trying to keep my brush just barely touching the surface of the paper. I'm going to rinse my brush in the soapy water once more before I continue to apply. There are some areas where the light source is creating some bright whites. So that's why I am adding some of this masking fluid because I don't want any of the shell colors to over dominate. Anywhere where I feel like the masking fluid might be a little on the thin side, just as a precaution, I'll do a second layer just to make sure I have good coverage. And just taking a moment to pause and really decide if I need any additional masking fluid at this stage. Okay, I feel pretty good about where I've applied the masking fluid, so I'm going to rinse my brush really thoroughly in the soapy water. I do not want any of that masking fluid in my brush because it will ruin it. And then I'm going to go a step further and rinse it in clean water so that soap isn't a part of my paints. While this masking fluid is drying, I'm going to go ahead and establish some of the paint colors I plan on using for today's shell. I'm using a large number 10 round to grab clean water from my clean water cup and bringing it right over to my paint palette. I'm going to be using a range of colors, and I just need to mix some of those up. So one of the first colors I will be mixing up is kind of this grayed out blue color. To make this color, I am going to use some cerulean blue. And that was way too much pigment, so I'm going to have to water that down a lot because I want this to be such a faint color that it's almost difficult to distinguish it from the bright whites. So really water down your color, not too much pigment. I'm also going to get the smallest amount of Payne's Gray to add to this blue. And when I feel like I might be close, I'm just going to grab a scrap piece of paper and test out the color. And this, since I'm going to have water on my seashell to start off with, this color might be all right. I have to keep in mind that because I'll be doing wet into wet, my color will be diluted with water. And because watercolors naturally dry to be 20% lighter, the color will be lighter still. So this color just might work. So I'm going to let that be. And the next color I'm going to mix up is really kind of a faint orange coral color. So I'm going to get some cadmium orange. I'm going to add the smallest amount of cerulean blue just to kind of give it a little bit more of an earthy tone. And then the tiniest bit of a pink because I want it to be a little bit more of a coral. When I feel like I'm getting close, I test it out. That's not quite as pink as I would like, so I'm going to get some more pink. So this is just permanent rose that I'm using. That feels better. I just need to water down my color. I do not need anything to be that dark. This is just a base color. I'm just tinting my whites of the shell. That is all I'm doing. So I do not need super potent colors. So just a nice soft color is all we need. And then lastly, I am going to get just a really soft muted orange. But I want this orange to be on the earthy side, so I can't use cadmium orange just straight out of the tube. I'm going to add its complementary color, which will be a little bit of that cerulean blue, so we can get it to more of an earthy tone. If you use too much cerulean blue, it might go straight to green. It's kind of fascinating, but that will happen. So once I feel like I have an earthy orange, I'm just going to lighten it up with some additional water. If you want your orange to be just a little warmer, you can add the smallest amount of pink. But I feel like that's a good color for me. All right, so I am going to start off with those three colors. Now I'm going to use clean water on the inside of my shell. All my masking fluid is completely dry, so I don't have to worry about it. I'm going to put water right on top of it. I just need to fill the inside shape of my seashell with clean water. take your time applying your clean water. Stay inside the shape of your shell, rotate your paper, and work comfortably, whatever you need to do to give yourself good visibility. But you don't want to rush this step. If you're sloppy with your water application, then your results are going to be sloppy. So just be patient, take your time. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Anytime you feel like you're falling behind, that's the benefit of a video. Just pause it. Don't work at a pace that is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be fun and relaxing. Okay, so I believe I have my entire shell covered in clean water. There are a few areas where I had started with my water application and the water has already begun to absorb into the paper. So I have to go back into these areas and give a second layer of water in order for them to stay wet long enough for me to get these colors in. Now, this particular paper, although it is one of the better brands, it is not my favorite, but I truly don't believe you need to start off your journey by breaking the bank. So this is kind of a medium grade paper that I feel like is very nice to work on. It just doesn't stay wet as long as I would prefer it. So just be mindful of that, and you'll have to kind of be willing to boogie and work quickly to get your base color in. So I'm going to tip my paper so you can see how glossy this is. All right, lots of water. All right, but there are no puddles and everything is nice and even. Once we have an even layer of water, this is where we're going to start adding a tint of color. So I'm grabbing that coral color. When I dip my brush in it, I wipe away the excess by dragging my brush across the rim of my palette. I'm going to start at the very end of the brush, or of the shell, my apologies. All right, I feel like I have this color in the areas that I need it. I'm going to get that orange color. If you have too much puddling of paint, it might cause you frustration and make it difficult to control. Just dry your brush off on a sponge or paper towel and give yourself a moment to kind of remove some of those puddles. Don't dry it out completely, but remove some of those puddles so it's a little easier to control. As I move towards the right side of the shell, there's significantly less color. So right now I'm just going to take a moment to absorb some of the puddling paint so I can bring it under control. So I rinsed my brush and I dried my brush off by tapping my sponge or paper towel with firm pressure. And that is just going to remove the moisture out of my brush so that I can then take my clean, dry brush to my painting. And I can use my dry brush to soak up any of the excess puddling of paint. I can go a step further, and if I press down with real firm pressure, I can actually soak up more of the color and reveal additional bright whites. So if you feel like there's an area where you want just a little bit more whites, then drag your brush by pressing firmly on your paper. There are a few key points of the shell where we have more whites, so by dragging a clean brush with firm pressure across those zones, it will really help. Now I still need to add the tint of blue to some of these whites. So after I kind of get my color under control to where I'm happy with it, keep in mind things are still very glossy and wet, so that gives me working time. Now I am going to grab some of that blue, and I'm going to go a little lighter just for this initial pass. And I'm going to drag some of these blues across some of the areas where I want some off-whites. I'm continuing with this really watered down, washed out blue, just to give a tint of color in a few other areas of the shell. And then before I consider this first layer done, I rinse my brush, I dry it firmly on my sponge, and I use that blotting technique where we take our dry brush and we drag and press down with firm pressure to pick up some of the color out of the areas where we want some brighter whites. Our goal is not to get the original white of the paper. We just want to have a little bit of a brighter color. And sometimes it takes a few passes. All right, I feel like that's a good place to start off. Right now, it's already looking very colorful. I'm going to pause the video and hit this with the blow dryer. Now that everything is completely dry, I am going to go a step further and apply masking fluid along the outside edge. Now, you might be wondering why I'm doing that. So, if you're familiar with today's subject, you'll notice that there's a lot of textured lines that go in this direction across our shell. And rather than feeling pressured to perfectly stop every line at the end of the shell and not past it or short of it, I'm going to apply masking fluid so I can freely apply that texture. The masking fluid will make everything line up really beautifully, and it just takes away some of the pressure from painting a subject like this. So we're going back to our masking fluid. So we want that soapy water. Coat your brush with it to protect your tool. Dip in your masking fluid. And we are going to stay just outside the shell. So you want to bring it right up to the edge of your shell. And we're going to do this the whole way around our subject. Make sure your masking fluid is wide enough to offer that relief and stress-free painting when you're doing your texture. If you make your masking fluid line too thin and narrow, you might accidentally still go over top of it and come in contact with your background, with your texture lines. So just go a little wide so you don't have to worry about it. Don't forget to rinse your brush occasionally. You don't want that masking fluid staying inside your brush too long, and then re-dip. Just make sure you're rinsing in that soapy water. Go really slow up against your edge for good results. If you apply your masking fluid and you're not happy with it, maybe you wobbled or whatever the occasion might be, you can always wait for it to dry and then remove the masking fluid and reapply it. Just don't try to fix it when it's still wet, because most of the time you're going to find that you didn't fully remove it and there will still be some errors in your masking fluid application that you may not be pleased with later. So just let it dry completely, peel it up, and then reapply if you are not happy with it. Now I'm going to rinse my brush really good in that soapy water. I want to make sure there's absolutely no masking fluid in my brush. And I'm going to go a step further and rinse in my regular water to ensure that there's no soap left in my brush. Soap and watercolor paints don't mix real well. So I now need to let this masking fluid completely dry before I move on to the next step. Now that the masking fluid is completely dry, we're going to mix up a couple different colors to use for the texture on our shell. So I'm going to continue using my number 10 round. I'm going to get some clean water and put it in a couple different wells of my palette. So I'm going to be mixing up probably just 2 additional colors. So one of the first colors I'm going to mix up is kind of this dark brown burgundy color. So I'm going to use some of my burnt umber. I want to add a little bit of that cadmium orange to warm it up. And I'm just going to test out this color to see where I'm at. So that feels like a color that could work for part of the lines, but this isn't quite as dark as I would like. So I'm going to add some additional pink, and I'm going to add some additional burnt umber to darken it up. That is definitely getting better. So I just keep adding some pink and burnt umber together. And I feel like that color there is what I'm looking for. The next color I'm going to mix up is going to be a little stronger on the pink side. So I'm going to use some burnt umber, but I'm going to be doing quite a bit of pink. I'm going to test that color out, see where we're at. And I like that color there. So it kind of ends up being a little bit more of a mauve color. Now we have some colors still remaining on our palette from when we did the background base color. I want to use these colors to just kind of give a little bit more definition and tint to a couple areas of our shell. But I want to make sure that these colors are watered down so it's just a glaze, so ever so faint of a color, nothing too intense. So to make sure my color is as light as I need it, and that's a nice glaze right there, just something nice and light. I add a lot of water to it. It should be the consistency of tea. Okay, it's just super faint. Once you have the color kind of adjusted the way you'd like, we're now going to apply this glaze on just parts of the shell. So not this first row of points on our shell, this second row that we have masked. I want to add some color to this area. And I'm kind of going around the shapes where we've masked to kind of allow space for those bumps. And then I'm going to bring this glaze down to the pencil line that was a part of our line drawing. And because we've applied masking fluid along the outer edge, I don't have to worry about accidentally hitting the background. It just stops it nice and clean. I'm going to grab this same glaze to apply some color on the opposite side. So there's a pencil line from our line drawing that I'm going up against. When I get close to where we have these little points on the shell, I'm just going to kind of round out my shapes. I'm going to soak up the puddling because that's what's making it look so dark. It is not, in fact, that dark. And as long as you don't have puddles, you can then move on to the next area. Now I am going to find this wide point in the center of our shell, and to the right of it, I need a glaze. So I'm making sure to dip my brush in that really light orange, but I'm wiping my brush off well so I don't bring too much of that color over. And I'm kind of moving my brush as it kind of curves around and then back in. When I get to this second point, my color is just going to stop and come down. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now I'm going to go to the opposite side and do another glaze, but I'm not going to come in contact with where I glazed previously. So I'm going to try and be mindful of it and kind of create a line that gives me a visual barrier. Making sure there's no puddles. I'm going to give some more glazes towards the end of my shell, going right up against the pencil line of my line drawing. Always soaking up the puddles with a dry brush so I don't have to worry about it. Now, towards the right of the shell, we have significantly lighter colors, so there's no need to apply any glazing in that area of the shell. I'm now going to switch to my watered down blue that I used for the base color. I want to make sure to create a really light version of it so it's more of a glaze. I'm going to show you how light this is. So it barely shows up on the paper. Very, very watered down. And the purpose of this particular glaze is just to indicate some of the shadows that we have on the back side here. So I want a glaze of blue just to be on the bottom edge of the masking fluid here. So it kind of reads like a shadow. I'm going to have another glaze to just indicate some of the texture of the shell. I'm going to do the same thing down here. I'm going to stay just to the bottom of this masking fluid shape here, the second one. And I'm just going to create a glaze in here with this soft blue, so it kind of indicates a shadow. I can't glaze too far to the left because a lot of those glazes are still damp or cold to the touch. So I'm just going to focus some texture lines towards the back of the shell here. So I'm going to hold my brush more vertical. And I just want a few lines to kind of indicate the texture. And I'm just pausing occasionally to really look at my reference photo before I paint anything additional. I'm going to stay to the left of these little masking fluid ovals here on the top, and I'm just going to do a little bit of a glaze to the left of them. I'm checking on my orange glazes, and those are now dry, so I can add a couple shadows on the underside here. So I'm going to find the second row of kind of masking fluid ovals. I'm going to go just to the very bottom of it and create a glaze that indicates a shadow on the underside of the shell there. And I want to stop short of the next masking fluid. I'm going to do the same thing up here. Just creating a glaze of that real watered down blue to indicate a shadow on the underside. So now I want to find where each spike is on the shell, and we have a shadow that is basically towards the bottom of the spike on the left, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the bottom of my masking fluid shape and create a shadow that kind of links up with the next one, just to give some shadow there. We just want to kind of give the impression of some contour. I'm now going to go through with this glaze color and ever so softly just indicate some of the texture through the shell. So I'm holding my brush more upright. I want some of these shadows and textures to just be really light. They don't have to be heavy-handed. They don't all have to be the same length. We're just basically adding some line work to the shell to indicate some of the texture. And notice how I'm not making all the lines the same length and shape. So just give a little bit of variety and be okay with wobbly lines. We need some texture in this shell. Once we have some texture, we're going to be putting that blue glaze aside. We're going to let this glaze dry so we can add some of the line texture next. Now that the glaze is completely dry, I'm going to use a number 2 round to add the line texture that is going across. I'm going to start with the line texture that's a little warmer. It's a little more on the orange side. And something to keep in mind is you don't always want every texture line to connect. So I'm coming in and creating some texture lines right through the center, and I'm varying the width of my lines. I can kind of thin out the lines and have some gaps in it. And when I get to the next horn of the shell, I can go a little wider. So in between the horns, I'm very sparing, keeping my lines real light, almost a dashed line. And I'm varying the width and making it look jagged on purpose. So try not to make your line work too consistent. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. This next line that I'm doing right now, I'm kind of following the pencil line from my line drawing transfer. And then I'm going to try and create a line that just kind of follows halfway through in between. I'm going to continue this line work on the opposite side. So I'm going to start right up against the edge of my glaze. Running right into the masking fluid, not worried about that at all. And I'm going to water down some of this brown so it's not quite as dark. And I'm going to continue with my line work. So I want these lines to kind of just follow the contour. I'm going to go right up against the edge of my glaze to do a little bit of a light line. I'm going to continue with that light watered down brown and try and keep my line work as perpendicular as possible so they're all running kind of the same curve pattern. I have to try and remind myself to kind of change the thickness from time to time so it doesn't look like too much of a pattern. Right up against the edge of the glaze again. These lines are going to be what really help give form and contour to our subject. So take your time with them. Don't go on autopilot. Pause once in a while and look at your reference photo because that's going to help significantly. Continuing with these lines and patterns, working with that light brown. As we get towards the end of the shell, the width between the lines is significantly wider. So don't go as close. It's kind of nice to have that masking fluid protecting the background so we don't have to worry about it. Now, right through the center here, we are going to have some horizontal lines, but for now, I'm just going to focus on trying to create this bumpy texture across here. So I'm still working with the light brown. Occasionally, I pick up my brush and then continue my line after a short distance. This part of the shell is significantly more textured, so the lines have to curve over a lot more bumps. So just be mindful of that. And whatever curved line you create first, you have to try and follow that pattern to the best of your ability on the next line. It feels very weird, I must admit. I'm going to kind of trace my pencil line here from my line drawing. Trying to keep my lines perpendicular. If they're not equal distance apart, that's okay. I'm not so much worried about that. I just want them to kind of curve up when they all curve up and curve down when they all curve down. If you're starting to go cross-eyed and all the lines are starting to look the same, you're not alone. Might be a good idea to take a break so you can start seeing the lines again for what they are. Tracing my line drawing pencil line. As I move towards the right side of my shell, I want my line work to become lighter. So really water down your brown. And what we're going to do is once we have our line work in with our light brown, then we're going to go back through with our darker brown colors and we're going to push the value of just certain areas of our texture. That's going to help make some areas look closer to us and other areas farther away. All right, so I need to let these lines on the right dry, but I can continue to push the values of the texture on the left. So I'm now going to work with that warmer brown, the one that is a little bit more on the orange side. And I want to push just certain textures. So up towards the front, I notice that there are some dark textures, but they're all in between kind of the bumps. So I'm picking up my brush and creating more of a dashed line. In this next section, our line work is relatively consistent. However, it stops just short of our reflection. So I'm going to darken up some of these lines and just try and stop short of the reflection. Once I get close to the horns on the shell again, it's a little bit more of a dashed line, so I occasionally pick up my brush so the line isn't as consistent. Same with on the opposite side. Now there isn't many dark lines on the very bottom in the shadow area, but just above the shadow, that's where I can start to darken up some of the lines. Some of these lines get a little shorter and not as consistent as we get closer to the points of the shell. On the opposite side, it's darker in between. So I'm kind of skipping sections as I apply my dark texture. The next line, however, is more consistent. Holding my brush up vertically, trying to be as feather light as I can so my lines don't get too wide. Just adding some dark lines on the underside. Hop into the next section. A little bit more of a dashed line in this curve. A little bit more of a dash line up at the top here. So choosing to have some areas where I kind of skip. In this midsection, it's a lot of dashed lines, so I'm going to be very random about it. I'm just going to choose a couple areas to darken, trying to allow a lot of the textured lines to be light. Same with the bottom area here. Just choosing a section to darken up, but allowing there to be some gaps and allowing there to be some lighter lines. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Okay, so now I am going to get the darkest brown that I've mixed up. And just in a few select areas, I'm going to really push the dark brown. So I feel like having a range of values like this in your finished subject is going to really, really help kind of push your painting to the next level. Changing your values and selectively only putting darks in a few areas is going to really help fit. Just trying to be mindful of where I want these darks and not doing it everywhere. And I feel like those are most of the darks that we need. So I'm now going to get some of the really light orange that we used on that base layer. And I'm now going to be creating texture in a few select areas going across the shell in this direction. So I want to kind of come between the masking fluid on the right And I want to create a curve between the two. When I get to the in between the next lines, I create another curve. And then the next line's the same thing. So I'm just going across, creating some texture. I'm going to do the same thing at the top here, except I'm not going to be as curved with my lines. I'm just going to do a couple soft orange texture lines across this top ridge here. I'm going to do a couple soft orange texture lines on the underside here as well. Right through the center area here, I'm going to create some texture. So I'm just using that soft orange. Trying not to be symmetrical about it, skipping some areas, being heavier handed in others. Just use that glaze of orange to push the texture in a few areas. Just have a gentle touch, doesn't have to be heavy-handed. Right through this area here, between our orange glazes from before, I'm going to add some more texture. Using that same light orange, so nothing too dark. Okay, we are at a place where we want everything to dry so we can remove the masking fluid and begin on additional details. Now that everything is completely dry, I'm going to use a rubber cement pickup to remove the masking fluid. And we're removing it from everywhere. If you don't have a rubber cement pickup, you can just rub the masking fluid off using your fingers. I've seen some people wrap a piece of scrap fabric around their finger that is white, and they use that to remove the masking. It's kind of nice having all those lines just magically end at the same point on the outside of our shell. There's definitely a time and place to use masking fluid to help. Okay, so right now it's kind of difficult to see some areas of our shell because it's right up against a bright white background. So I'm now going to add a background, and I'm going to apply clean water to my background first. And I'm going to be using just a real soft blue, that cerulean blue, for my background color. So if you don't want to mix your color on the fly, you can mix your color first before you wet the background. But I'm just going to be adding some additional pigment to my existing color on my palette. I'll just pull some of it aside. I'm allowing about 1/8 of an inch of dry paper between my water and the shell. I rather be short than to accidentally push blues into my shell. It's going to be a lot easier to see where I'm applying my color once I have paint on my brush. If there are areas that are not staying wet, take a moment to do a second application of water. So on my paint palette, I have a lot of that watered down blue that we used in the shell on the first layer. I'm going to pull some of that aside into a new well, and I'm just going to add more pigment to it so the blue is stronger. So I'm using my large brush to just bring some of that paint over to a new well, and then I'm going to grab additional pigment to darken it up, and I'm going to use this color for around my subject. This paper is wanting to dry very quickly. Not my favorite, but it's just kind of the natural way of watercolors. So I'm just going to keep working my way around the shell. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I have these little sweater fuzzes all over my studio at the moment. It'll teach me to wear a fuzzy hoodie while I'm painting. Be mindful of where you put your masking fluid for the highlights on the upper portion so you don't bring your blues down too far. Take a moment to look at your reference photo and follow that outside contour shape, because it can be easy to accidentally put the blues inside some of your highlights. I'm going to make sure there's no puddles, so I'm drying my brush off on my sponge or paper towel and using a dry brush to soak up any puddling. Allowing puddles to sit on your watercolor paper through the drying process will result in blooms. So wherever there's a puddle, it'll be the last point on your paper to dry. And because it's excess moisture and the areas around it will have dried before, it will create a blooming texture back into those surrounding areas. So if you want a consistent, predictable result when your paint dries, just take the extra moment to soak up the puddles of paint. They love to hang out on the edge of your block and in your low points. Okay, I now have to hit this with the blow dryer so we can do the final touches. Now that the background is dry, I can take a look at any other areas where I might want to make some adjustments. So for example, where we applied masking fluid on basically the points of the shell that we didn't want to get too dark, if any of those areas have a little bit too big of a jump to the values nearby, you can take this opportunity to soften the colors so it's not so obvious. So for example, I can take my clean paper towel here, and let's say I don't like how the whites in this area do a big leap to the soft blues. Okay, maybe I want that to be more subtle. I take a stiff square brush that's wet, and I come in to the areas of color that are nearby, and I do a little bit of scrubbing to lift that color and soften it, and then I press down with a paper towel. So that transition between my bright whites and those colors nearby, it's not such a big leap, okay? So I can do this same technique anywhere on my painting where I feel like, oh, that was a little bit of a jump. Doesn't look as natural. I would like it to just be a little softer. That's when we can come in and just brighten up a little bit of our colors there. Now, since we're working on quality paper, the paper puts up with some of this, but I'm really not pushing down super hard because I still don't want to run the risk of damaging the paper and having it tear on me. So I'm just trying to go in with a little bit of gentle pressure and a clean brush to soften some of these. Now, if you happen to have bright white gouache or this bleed-proof white, you can actually add some additional texture on your shell as a final touch. And I'm sorry I didn't put this on my list of materials at the beginning of the video. I kind of forgot I was going to use it. So I'm just dipping my paintbrush into this bright white. I want to make sure to twirl my brush off, and I want this white to be watered down enough that it's not goopy or skipping as I drag it across the paper. And what I can do now is using very light pressure, I can come into the center here and I can say, I want some white texture that goes across this area of the shell. So I can come in here and I can just create some of that white texture. These are kind of like scuff marks on the shell showing its age. So wherever you want little scuff marks, just try to change the length of your lines. And where they are, don't make them too perfect and predictable. Just kind of following the contour. But you can see how these little white scuff marks really make a difference in the end result. Make sure you don't have too much white paint on your brush or you're going to make really wide lines. Wipe off the excess paint. These are those final details that you want to have a lot of patience for because it makes a difference. Some of the white on the underside of my shell, I want them to look like little bumps. So I'm just coming in with some white to emphasize their points. But otherwise, that's how you paint a seashell. If you enjoyed this tutorial, do me a favor, leave a comment, give me a thumbs up, share it with friends, and go a step further and follow me. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I hope you learned a lot. Keep painting.